Hey everyone, welcome back to Christians and Culture. A somewhat somber video today. Earlier this week, of course, if you've been looking at the news, a very terrible event occurred at a school in Texas. Many people, many children lost their lives. And one of the worst parts of it is that the act itself was carried out by someone who was little more than a child. I think the offender, was 19, but barely beyond what we consider the legal age of an adult. And unfortunately, in the modern world, probably not really an adult, probably not prepared for the world, probably not given the necessary skills needed to interact with the world. And it hurts when you look at a situation like this. It hurts because it seems like every time something like this happens, every conversation goes towards laws and rights and how do we prevent this happening in the future. And that's not to say those are unimportant questions, but treating the symptom of the disease doesn't fix the disease. It still leaves the underlying problem. And the underlying problem is an abandoned generation. We have generations of children, some of which are now well into their midlife. Generations of children who grew up with parents that were concerned about themselves and not their children. And I'm not going to get into the socioeconomic, psychological aspects of everything. Instead, I want to take a look at it from the scriptural standpoint. I'm sure parents are well aware, if you've been in the church, that you have a great duty to your children. But have you thought about your duty to the children of others? You're not called to raise other people's children. That's not really the case. But that doesn't mean you can't have an influence over them. In fact, I dare say that as the world continues to get more and more callous, as parents become more and more selfish, as each successive generation becomes less concerned with those that they are responsible for and more concerned with being their own person and doing their own thing, the influence of a godly man and woman becomes all the more important. I don't know the history of the young man who committed that heinous act down in Texas. I would guess that he probably did not have a very loving home. That he probably felt abandoned, worthless, as if no one cared about him. I wonder what would have been different if he grew up knowing that the God of the universe loved him. That no matter how much his family did not take care of him, no matter how much his friends did not treat him well, no matter how much those around him seemed to show little interest in his life and his path, that there was still a God who cared. What if there had just been one voice in his life letting him know he was loved? Not just loved conditionally, not just loved when he did well, but loved with a love that defines the entirety of existence. Loved with a love that went to a cross for him. In Luke 9, starting in verse 46, we read, "An argument arose among them," and that is the disciples, "as to which of them was the greatest. But Jesus, knowing the reasoning of their hearts, took a child and put him by his side, and said to them, Whoever receives this child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives him who sent me. For he who is least among you all is the one who is great." Now this is probably the same event that we read in other Gospels where they were arguing who's the greatest among them, and Jesus says, whoever wants to be first should be last, you have to become a servant. But here we see the context put into the relationship of the disciples treating well a child. Presumably this child did not belong to any of the disciples. It doesn't say specifically, but it's very likely this child did not belong to the disciples. So when Jesus took this child aside, he wasn't taking aside a child who had a parent right there. Instead, he was taking aside a child and looking at those who followed him and saying, if you want to be great in my kingdom, serve these. Serve the children. Teach them about a God that loves them. Raise them in a manner befitting of the Lord. Show them that Jesus, the one who came to die for them, is always near at hand. I fear that we as the church have not taken that as seriously as we ought to, especially in the modern day. It's been lamented many times over that the church is getting older. Young people aren't sticking around, and there are reasons for that. They go well beyond just how we raise our children, certainly. But I do wonder where the days have gone when a family would say to another family that didn't necessarily go to church, hey, can we take your children with us on Sunday morning? Hey, do you want your kid to come over and play with mine so they can have a godly influence? Instead, the church seems to be becoming more insular, more withdrawn, more secluded. Usually that's done because we're afraid of becoming like the world, but in doing so, we shut out all these children that we were commanded to serve. Jesus didn't pull aside an adult and say, serve this person. He pulled aside a child. In Proverbs 13, verse 22, we read, a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, but the sinner's wealth is laid up for the righteous. It's likely that the writer of the proverb, presumably Solomon, was speaking about wealth, money. But I think there's more to the idea of laying up an inheritance for our children's children than just money. What is the legacy we're leaving for the next generation? Are we leaving them a legacy of love, of godly ways, of care, of knowing that no matter what else happens in the world, no matter what else they see on TV, no matter what else anyone says to them, there's at least a God who cares for them? And then hopefully showing that love through ourselves. Are we doing that? Are we leaving an inheritance for not just our children, but our children's children? Are we doing as Christ commanded and receiving the next generation? I do wonder how different it might have been if that young man had known how much he was loved. It's a somber thought. It's not exciting. I apologize if it's brought anyone's day down, but the simple fact of the matter is the church is not doing what it's supposed to do as a whole when it comes to raising up the next generation. Too many children are out there in the world, outside of the four walls of the church, completely unaware that they are loved. And instead they are bombarded by the negativity, the hate, the cruelty of a world that does not care for them. They need to know that Jesus came for them too. And they can't know that unless someone tells them. That's all we have here for Christians and Culture today. I'm going to leave you with that thought, and I encourage you to think about it. Think about it in your own life. Where are those around you, those young children, those young people who maybe aren't part of the church but so desperately need to know that they are in fact loved, that they are in fact cared for by the God of heaven and earth? When you see them, receive them in the name of Christ. That's it for this video. We'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, everybody.